The elevator climbed through 60 floors, carrying all of Emily Dawson's dreams and fears in its mirrored cabin. As she adjusted her navy blue blazer for the 10th time, the one she had bought specifically for this day, her first day as executive secretary at Grant Enterprises, one of New York City's most powerful companies. At 28, Emily had left behind the quiet town of Charleston, South Carolina, where everyone knew her as the teacher's daughter, or the girl who worked at the library, and now surrounded by the steel and glass of the financial district's tallest skyscraper, she felt like a stranger in foreign territory. The metallic voice announced the 47th floor, and Emily took a deep breath, inhaling the subtle perfume she had sprayed on her wrist, mingling with the aroma of coffee from the thermos she held tightly, reminding herself of her mother's words that coffee was the best companion for difficult moments. The elevator doors opened to a lobby that looked like it had stepped straight out of an architecture magazine, with Italian marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a breathtaking view of New York as impeccably dressed employees moved with purpose, speaking into cell phones and carrying expensive leather briefcases. A voice came from behind, and Emily turned to see an elegant woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a professional smile that did not reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Collins, Director of Human Resources, and welcomed Emily to Grant Enterprises before guiding her through glass-walled conference rooms, a break room with an Italian coffee machine, and sleek workstations equipped with cutting-edge technology. She explained that Emily would be responsible for the CEO Alexander Grant's schedule and that he demanded perfection, punctuality, and complete discretion. Emily nodded, even though her stomach tightened, but Margaret murmured that she doubted. Emily understood before stopping in front of the double dark wood doors with a golden nameplate reading, Alexander Grant, Chief Executive Officer. Margaret showed Emily the elegant workspace positioned directly across from the CEO's office, reminding her that he always arrived at exactly 7:30, and that it was 7:25 now. Emily's heart raced as she realized she was about to meet her new boss. Margaret listed instructions about his coffee, black with no sugar at exactly 65 degrees Celsius, and how appointments must be confirmed twice. But the sound of the elevator doors interrupted her words, and Margaret stiffened before whispering, "He's here." Emily's palms grew damp as she smoothed her brown hair into its neat bun and straightened her shoulders just as firm footsteps echoed down the hallway with such commanding force that the very air seemed to shift. Then Alexander Grant appeared, a tall and broad man in a charcoal gray suit tailored perfectly to his frame. His dark hair tousled just enough to suggest effortless confidence. His presence so powerful it seemed to draw all focus toward him. His green eyes locked on Emily's, and she felt as though he could see through her completely. His voice, deep and steady, greeted Margaret and confirmed that Emily was his new secretary. He extended his hand, interrupting Margaret's introduction, and told Emily he hoped she was prepared for the pace of his company. When Emily took his hand, she felt a current run through her arm, his grip firm and warm and holding on a second, longer than necessary. She replied that she was more than prepared, and though a flicker of surprise or approval crossed his gaze, it was gone in an instant. He released her hand and instructed her to bring him coffee in 5 minutes, review the week's schedule, and prepare a contract analysis for 9 o'clock sharp, before closing his office door with a decisive click. Margaret exhaled with a weary smile and called him Hurricane Grant, but Emily remained still, her skin tingling with the memory of his touch and the weight of that emerald gaze. She didn't know it yet, but the spark ignited in that brief moment would change both their lives forever. 3 days had passed since Emily's first encounter with Alexander Grant, and in that short time she had built an efficient routine that impressed even the most seasoned employees at Grant Enterprises. Her files were immaculate. Her ability to anticipate Alexander's needs was almost instinctive, and she had already memorized the details of his most important clients, their histories, and their preferences. On a particularly busy Thursday morning, Alexander had been in meetings since 8 o'clock, while Emily coordinated every detail with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. She was reviewing contracts when sudden raised voices carried through the otherwise controlled atmosphere of the 47th floor. Startled, Emily looked up to see a tall man in his early 60s striding toward her desk. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his three-piece suit cut to perfection, his expression radiating authority so intense it demanded instant obedience. It was impossible not to recognize Charles Grant, the older and sterner version of Alexander and the man who had built the Grant empire. Emily stood quickly to greet him, but he brushed her words aside with a dismissive hand and marched straight toward Alexander's office. Without knocking, he opened the door and strode inside, leaving Emily caught between following him or pretending she hadn't seen anything. Her decision was made for her when Alexander's sharp, irritated voice carried into the hallway. "Father, I told you I will not discuss this now." Charles's voice thundered back that his son had wasted enough time and that the Ashford family had been waiting for months. Emily's curiosity overpowered her professionalism, and she found herself inching closer to the slightly open door, catching sight of Alexander standing tense behind his desk, with his hands pressed against the polished mahogany surface. His father paced like a general delivering orders, declaring that Victoria Ashford was the perfect match. Harvard-educated, from an impeccable family, with connections that would push Grant Enterprises further into Europe. Alexander's response was low and edged with steel as he reminded his father that he was the one who would have to live with her, not the company. Charles dismissed his words with cold practicality, insisting that marriage was not about love, but about strategy, just as his own had been functional and beneficial for 35 years until death separated him from Alexander's mother. The disdain in Alexander's tone was unmistakable as he repeated the word functional, his jaw tightening in visible frustration. Emily, still hidden by the doorframe, felt a pang in her chest as she realized Alexander's aloofness and relentless control masked the wound of losing his mother and being raised under such ruthless expectations. Charles ended the debate by issuing a final ultimatum. Alexander had until the end of the month to give the Ashfords a positive answer, and a dinner had already been scheduled at the Grant estate for Saturday night. With that, he stormed out, pausing only to glance at Emily with icy eyes and remind her that the family valued its privacy above all else. Emily met his gaze steadily and replied that discretion was part of her job, earning a small nod before he disappeared into the elevator. Moments later, a loud crash echoed from inside Alexander's office as something heavy shattered against the wall. Emily hesitated, then knocked softly and entered to find him standing by the window, his shoulders tense, his hands buried in his pockets, the shards of a crystal vase scattered across the floor. He apologized for the mess, but she quietly fetched a broom and began sweeping, telling him gently that sometimes breaking a vase was better than breaking something that could never be repaired. His green eyes found hers, exhaustion written across his face, and he asked bluntly if she had heard the conversation. Emily admitted she had heard part of it, and when he asked her opinion on arranged marriages, she told him firmly that everyone deserved the freedom to choose who they would spend their life with, that love was not foolish fantasy but the only thing that made life truly worthwhile. Something flickered in his gaze, surprise, perhaps even gratitude, before he masked it again. He instructed her to cancel his Saturday night appointments as he had no choice but to attend the family dinner, and Emily's heart tightened at the resignation in his voice. Before leaving, she told him that sometimes courage was not about fighting monsters, but simply about saying no at the right time. For a fleeting instant, she saw hope cross his features, and when she returned to her desk, she realized she had crossed an invisible line, stepping into his personal life in a way that felt dangerously intimate, yet she could not regret it. Saturday arrived draped in a fine mist of rain that made New York City look heavy and melancholic. Emily Dawson tried to distract herself by walking through small shops and parks, but her thoughts kept circling back to Alexander Grant and the dinner he was being forced to attend at his family's estate. She couldn't shake the image of his resignation when he had told her about it, and every time she remembered, her chest tightened with something she refused to name. By Monday morning, she was back in the skyscraper, arriving early as usual, but to her surprise, Alexander was already in his office, his tie slightly askew, his dark circles showing he hadn't slept properly. She greeted him with his perfectly prepared coffee, asked about his weekend, but he simply muttered enlightening without lifting his eyes from the spreadsheets. Before she could leave, voices echoed in the hallway and her stomach knotted as she recognized them. Charles Grant entered without knocking, followed by Victoria Ashford, a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a high-fashion magazine. Her platinum hair framed sharp blue eyes that glinted with entitlement as she moved across the office with deliberate grace. Draped in an elegant camel wool coat, she greeted Alexander with false sweetness, remarking on his tired appearance as though she were already his wife. Emily instinctively took a step back to leave, but Victoria's gaze found her first. "And who is this?" she asked coldly. Alexander's voice came out tense as he replied, "My secretary, Emily Dawson." Victoria's smile widened but without warmth as she dismissed Emily as temporary staff who would be replaced when she and Alexander married. The implication stung, but before Emily could react, Alexander's voice sliced through the room like a blade. He declared that no one would be dismissed and that there was no engagement to announce. Victoria faltered, her tone sharpening as she insisted the dinner had sealed everything, but Alexander stood firm, saying he would not marry someone he didn't love. Charles tried to intervene, pressing responsibilities and duty, but Alexander's voice grew sharper as he declared that he had responsibilities to himself above all. When Victoria scoffed at love as something reserved for ordinary people, her eyes flicking toward Emily with disdain, something inside Emily snapped. With a steady voice, she said that love was what truly made people extraordinary. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria's eyes burned with contempt. Charles looked stunned, and Alexander's gaze locked on Emily with such intensity she felt the air leave her lungs. Then in one swift movement that shocked everyone, including himself, Alexander crossed the office, cupped Emily's face in his hands, and kissed her. It was not tentative, not gentle, but a kiss charged with years of suppression, defiance, and longing for freedom. Emily's world disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his lips, the strength of his hands, and the overwhelming surge of emotions she had no defense against. When he finally released her, his eyes still burned with intensity, but his mask slid back into place. With a perfectly calm voice, he turned to his father and Victoria and introduced Emily as his girlfriend, claiming they had been together for 3 months. Victoria's shock was palpable as she stammered her disbelief. Alexander pulled Emily to his side, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist, and described her as intelligent, brave, and everything he had ever wanted in a partner. Charles exploded with anger, but Alexander remained composed, declaring it was not a whim but love. The word hung in the air like an explosion, shaking the foundations of the room. Victoria stormed out in fury, her heels echoing across the marble, while Charles stayed a moment longer, his face flushed with outrage yet shadowed by something closer to respect, before finally leaving with a warning that it wasn't over. When the doors closed, silence filled the room. Alexander's arm slowly slipped from Emily's waist and he apologized for what he had done. But Emily, still trembling with the aftermath of that kiss, told him he had every right not to be forced into something he didn't want. They looked at each other, the weight of the moment pressing between them. Emily tried to lighten the heaviness by joking about their supposed 3-month anniversary, and to her surprise, Alexander laughed, an unguarded, genuine sound she had never heard from him before. That laughter, along with the shared smile that followed, marked the first fragile step into a dangerous charade, a lie that would soon consume both of them far beyond what either had imagined. The rest of that morning passed in a haze as Emily tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept replaying the moment Alexander had kissed her in front of his father and Victoria Ashford. Her lips still burned with the memory. Her pulse quickened whenever she caught sight of him, and yet she forced herself to carry on with the phones, the contracts, and the endless emails. By 11:30, when the last client left his office, Alexander appeared at her desk with an unreadable expression and asked her to come inside. He closed the door behind them, and instead of sitting at his desk, he pulled a chair to face her, his posture strangely intimate. His eyes softened with something that almost looked like guilt as he admitted he should apologize again for everything that had happened that morning. She spoke his name softly, using Alexander for the first time, telling him she understood why he had acted out of desperation. Something flickered in his gaze at the sound of his name from her lips, but he pressed on, confessing that dragging her into this mess could damage her career and reputation. Emily tilted her head and studied him carefully before asking the inevitable question. So now what happens? He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and said he had a proposal, though he knew it was asking a lot. She finished his thought out loud, realizing what he meant. He wanted her to pretend to be his girlfriend. He nodded, admitting that Victoria would not give up easily and his father would only intensify the pressure if the kiss was revealed to be impulsive. But if they truly believed he had a serious relationship with Emily, they might back off long enough for him to find a permanent solution. Emily leaned back, crossing her legs, the surreal nature of the situation pressing down on her. To pretend to be the girlfriend of one of New York's most powerful men seemed absurd, and yet the vulnerability in his expression reminded her of the way he had defended her against Victoria's cruel words. She asked how long he expected this arrangement to last, and he replied a few months, 6 at most, long enough to convince everyone that his decision was final. She asked what it would involve, and he explained that it would mean attending social events, some family dinners, perhaps even public appearances, but quickly added that nothing intimate would be expected. His cheeks flushed as he said it, and Emily nearly smiled, remembering how public their earlier kiss had been. With careful calculation, she asked what her compensation would be, and his answer was practical: double her current salary, a $50,000 performance bonus at the end of 6 months, and a recommendation letter that could open doors to any company in New York. Emily did the math silently and realized it was a fortune compared to her modest salary, enough to pay her debts, help her mother with medical bills, and finally breathe without the constant pressure of money. But she knew she couldn't just accept without conditions. She laid them out one by one. First, no surprise kisses. If they needed to show affection publicly, she wanted prior warning to prepare herself. He nodded, though his eyes betrayed the memory of the kiss they had already shared. Second, she demanded to maintain her professional independence. She would not be treated like a trophy or accessory. Her intelligence and judgment had to remain respected. He agreed immediately, saying it would even make the relationship more convincing because everyone knew he would never tolerate a partner who lacked substance. The comment warmed her more than she wanted to admit, but she continued to her final condition: total transparency between them. If circumstances changed, if he no longer needed the act, or if either of them developed emotional complications, they had to discuss it openly. Her words made her blush, but she didn't look away. Alexander studied her in silence before repeating emotional complications slowly, asking if she was worried it might actually happen. Emily kept her composure and explained that pretending to be intimate, spending so much time together, could blur the lines between performance and reality. He turned away, walking toward the wide window, his hands buried in his pockets, admitting that she was right and boundaries were essential. Yet his voice carried a hint of disappointment, as though the idea of such boundaries cut deeper than he wanted to show. Finally, he turned back and asked if there were any other conditions. Emily added one last rule: that once the arrangement ended, they would return to a strictly professional relationship without awkwardness or lingering embarrassment. His emerald eyes studied her with an intensity that made her skin tingle as he asked if she truly believed that was possible after months of acting like lovers. Her voice was firm as she replied that it had to be possible because the alternative was too complicated. He returned to his chair, nodded, and extended his hand to seal the deal. She placed hers in his, and instantly the same electric current rushed through both of them, forcing them to release quickly as though they had touched fire. His voice was steadier when he said they would need to begin rehearsing their love story, and she agreed, though her heart raced at the way he used the word love, even if it was all an act. He suggested they begin that very night with dinner at his apartment so they could align their story before his father returned with more questions. She agreed, asking what time, and he answered 7:30 with Chinese food. When she rose to leave, he stopped her once more, his voice softer now, thanking her for helping him despite the strange circumstances. She replied that they were partners now, and though she tried to keep her tone simple, the words carried more weight than she realized. As she walked back to her desk, she couldn't help but wonder in how many ways they would become partners in the months ahead, and whether she could protect her heart when every moment still burned with the memory of his kiss. Alexander Grants, Penthouse on the Upper East Side was everything Emily Dawson had imagined it would be. A discreet display of wealth and impeccable taste, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, designer furniture blending seamlessly with modern art, and a quiet sense of order that felt curated rather than lived in. She arrived at exactly 7:30, wearing a simple navy blue dress that was the most elegant piece she owned, and he greeted her at the door in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves, a more relaxed version of himself, that somehow made him look younger, softer, and far more approachable than the intimidating CEO she faced at the office each morning. He smiled as he took her coat, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, sending a spark through her nerves. She complimented his home, noting its beauty, and he admitted with an ironic edge that he spent so little time there it sometimes felt more like a luxury hotel than a real home. A confession that carried a subtle loneliness she hadn't expected. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang and he excused himself to fetch the food, leaving Emily to wander along the shelves filled with photographs. She saw pictures of him with his parents, his mother's warm smile a striking contrast to his father's stern presence, images of his college graduation, and awards for business achievements, but no sign of a personal life. No girlfriends, no close friends, no intimacy. His life looked carefully curated, stripped of anything too vulnerable. He returned carrying aromatic bags of Chinese food, joking lightly as he set them on the glass coffee table. They opened containers of orange chicken, Mongolian beef, rice, and spring rolls enough for far more than two, and settled comfortably on the Italian leather sofa as though they were already used to sharing space. Emily teased him about their supposed love story, asking how they had first met at the Boston conference, and he recited the details with unnerving precision, speaking of the Fairmont Hotel in January, and her asking him a question after his lecture. She laughed, pointing out that she had been working at a Charleston library at the time, but he smoothly adjusted the story, saying she could have been a freelance consultant attending for a local company. They began weaving their fabricated history together, recalling how she had impressed him with her questions, how they had spent 3 hours talking in the lobby, how he had been drawn to her intelligence and her determination to prove herself beyond small-town expectations. Emily's chest warmed as he revealed he had read every detail in her personnel file long before hiring her, from her mother being a teacher to her volunteer work and her academic achievements. There was something unexpectedly touching about the way he had sought to understand her. And when he admitted that all her references described her as intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely honest, she felt her cheeks heat with a mix of pride and embarrassment. The conversation shifted to appearances, and Emily voiced her worry that she would never fit naturally into his world of galas and elite circles, explaining that her Target dresses could not possibly convince anyone she belonged. At his side, Alexander frowned but quickly agreed to take her shopping, insisting it would be a company expense and necessary for their story to hold. She tried to resist, saying she didn't need diamonds, but he countered with the idea of something personal, something that told a story. Then he moved to the elegant bar and returned with a small navy velvet box, placing it in her hands. Her heart pounded as she opened it and gasped at the delicate white gold necklace with a small, star-shaped pendant, encrusted with tiny diamonds. Before she could protest, he told her it had belonged to his mother, the piece his father had given her on their first wedding anniversary, the one she wore every day. Emily's eyes widened as she realized the depth of what he was offering her. Not just a prop for their charade, but something sacred and irreplaceable. She whispered that she couldn't accept it, but his voice was steady as he said it was only temporary, a piece of truth within their performance, and it had to be real enough to fool his family. Her fingers trembled as she touched the necklace, sensing the trust he was placing in her. When he asked if she would let him put it on, she turned, lifting her hair to bare her neck. His fingers brushed lightly against her skin as he fastened the clasp, and the warmth of his body so close sent shivers down her spine. For a moment he lingered, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, his breath close enough for her to feel. "Perfect," he murmured, his voice low and rough, and when she turned back, their eyes locked with a closeness that made her lips part in anticipation. The world seemed to stop as he leaned closer, their faces only inches apart. But just as her eyes closed, his phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the moment like a blade. They both pulled back quickly, struggling to compose themselves, and while he answered in low tones, she lifted her hand to the necklace, seeing its delicate sparkle in the reflection of the window. It was perfect against her skin, but what worried her more was the look in her own eyes, the dangerous awareness that she was already beginning to forget this was supposed to be an act. The weekend arrived heavy with anticipation, and by Sunday evening, Emily Dawson stood in front of the mirror, in her small Brooklyn apartment, adjusting the teal silk dress she and Alexander had chosen together on Fifth Avenue. It was elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but still carried the warmth of her personality, and around her neck glowed the delicate star-shaped pendant that had once belonged to Alexander's mother, a reminder of the trust he had placed in her. When the doorbell rang precisely at 5:30, she found Alexander waiting in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his expression calm, but his shoulders tense as though he were preparing for battle. During the drive to the Grant family estate in the Hamptons, the atmosphere inside the limousine was charged. Emily teased him about being nervous, but he admitted openly that he was, explaining that his family excelled at finding weaknesses and exploiting them. She tried to reassure him, reminding him that they had practiced their story a dozen times and knew every detail of their supposed romance. But his hand found hers in the dim light and his voice dropped to a whisper. Together, she squeezed his hand back and repeated the word, and for a brief moment it didn't feel like an act. The Grant estate loomed like something out of an old aristocratic painting, with perfectly manicured gardens, white columns, and windows glowing with golden light. Inside, chandeliers sparkled above marble floors and servants moved with practiced discretion. At the entrance, they were greeted by Patricia Patterson, Alexander's aunt, who welcomed Emily with surprising warmth and guided them into the drawing room where nearly 15 family members mingled with champagne glasses in hand. Seated near the fireplace was Edward Grant, Alexander's grandfather, a man in his 80s whose presence was still commanding. His white hair gleamed under the lights, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence, and when Alexander introduced Emily, Edward studied her with amusement before declaring she must be the young woman who had finally managed to capture his stubborn grandson's heart. Emily inclined her head slightly in a graceful gesture and addressed him with quiet respect, which made his eyes sparkle with approval as he invited her to sit beside him and tell him how she had tamed the lone wolf of the family. The warmth of the moment didn't last. A familiar crystalline voice carried from the doorway, cold and dripping with disdain, and Emily turned to see Victoria Ashford entering in a blood-red dress that shimmered like a weapon. At her side stood Braden Whitmore, polished and confident, a man from one of Boston's wealthiest families. The room shifted as whispers rippled across it, and Charles Grant appeared behind them, clearly uneasy with the timing yet unwilling to stop Victoria from intruding. Emily felt Victoria's eyes, on her like a predator circling prey. The introductions were made, Braden shaking her hand with a grip that lingered too long, and then Victoria's sharp tongue began its work. She dismissed Emily's past as a small-town librarian as though it were a laughable detail, mocked her, transitioned into Grant Enterprises as convenient, and implied that Alexander's sudden love story was nothing but opportunism. For a moment, Emily considered staying silent, but then she remembered Alexander's words in the limousine, and she chose to fight. With a serene voice, she explained that skills like organization, attention to detail, and foresight were as vital in a library as they were in a corporate office, and that love was not about status or bank accounts, but about truly seeing another person's soul. Her words carried across the room, and the silence that followed was heavy until Edward Grant tapped his cane with a sharp crack and praised her, declaring that she was a treasure and that Alexander would be a fool to let her go. Alexander moved to stand behind Emily's chair, placing his hand gently on her shoulder as he confirmed to his grandfather that he had no intention of letting her slip away. The intensity in his green eyes as he looked at her made her heart stumble in her chest, and for a brief moment the entire performance felt frighteningly real. Victoria's smile fractured under the weight of the family's approval, and though she attempted to mask her fury behind a veneer of elegance, her eyes burned with the promise of retaliation. As the evening carried on, Emily moved among the family, Members with poise, answering questions about their supposed romance, sharing details of the invented Boston conference meeting with confidence, and responding to skepticism with calm assurance. Every time she wavered, Alexander was there at her side, steadying her with a subtle glance, a whispered word, or the quiet pressure of his hand at her back. By the time they left, Edward had declared her the most refreshing addition to the family in years, and Patricia had kissed her cheek as though she were already part of them. But as the limousine pulled away and Emily leaned back in the seat, exhaling, in relief she caught sight of Alexander's reflection in the window. He wasn't smiling at the success of their act. He was looking at her with something deeper, something that made her wonder whether either of them truly remembered this was all supposed to be pretend. 2 weeks after the dinner at the Grant Mansion, Emily Dawson had settled into her new double life, balancing her professional duties with the carefully staged performance of being Alexander Grant's girlfriend. Together they attended dinners with clients, discreet lunches with family members, and small social appearances where every look and touch was a part of their act. Yet with each event, the line between pretending and feeling grew thinner until it sometimes felt as though they were no longer performing at all. On a Thursday evening, Alexander took her to a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum, an event where New York's wealthiest gathered to raise funds for education. Emily wore a simple black cocktail dress they had chosen together, understated yet elegant, and the star-shaped pendant glowed warmly against her skin under the museum lights. Throughout the evening, Alexander kept his hand at the small of her back, whispered comments in her ear that made her laugh, and looked at her with such intensity that other women in the room sighed with envy. They moved easily together, circulating through the glittering crowd, sharing practiced anecdotes about their supposed romance and posing for photographs that would appear in the society columns the next morning. But beneath the flawless performance, Emily felt a growing heat, an awareness that the way he held her and the way his gaze lingered were no longer entirely part of the script. During a break between speeches, Alexander led her out onto the museum's terrace, overlooking the dark sweep of Central Park. The city lights shimmered in the distance, casting everything in a golden glow. He handed her a glass of champagne and told her softly that she was doing perfectly, that half the women inside were envious of the way he looked at her. When she asked about the other half, he smiled faintly and said they were envious of the way she looked at him. His tone was quieter now, less performative, carrying an honesty that made her heart quicken. For a moment, they stood side by side, the cool night air brushing against them. And then Emily asked the question she had been holding back. She wanted to know why he had never married, why he had never truly committed to anyone, and she told him not to give her the corporate excuse about being too focused on work. He was silent for a long time, staring at the glittering city. Before, he finally admitted the truth. He said it was because he had never met anyone who made him want to stop pretending that he didn't need anyone, pretending that business and achievements were enough, pretending that he wasn't lonely. His voice carried a vulnerability she had never heard from him before, and when he turned to face her completely, his eyes dark with unspoken emotion, she felt her defenses falter. He stepped closer, so near she could feel the warmth radiating from him, and asked her quietly if any of this still felt like acting. Her breath caught as his hand rose to touch her cheek, his thumb tracing her skin with such gentleness that her eyes blurred with unshed tears. She whispered that it didn't feel like acting anymore, and in that instant the last barrier between them broke. When his lips finally touched hers, it was nothing like the desperate kiss in his office, nothing like the impulsive defiance he had shown before. This kiss was tender and deliberate, slow and searching, filled with an honesty that shook her to her core. She melted into him, her hands resting against his chest, feeling his heart beat fast and strong beneath her fingers, as though it matched her own racing pulse. His hand slid into her hair, pulling her closer, and for a long moment the world beyond the terrace ceased to exist. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their foreheads pressed together, neither willing to let go. His voice was rough as he whispered her name and asked what they were doing, and she confessed she didn't know, only that she could no longer deny what she felt. He admitted the same, his honesty frightening and liberating all at once. The applause from inside the museum snapped them back to reality. They composed themselves and returned to the gala, smiling and laughing as though nothing had changed. But every glance and every accidental touch was now loaded with a new weight. In the limousine, afterward they sat apart, silent yet bound by the memory of the kiss they had shared beneath the stars. And when he dropped her at her apartment and she asked softly what came next, he told her the only thing he knew, that he could no longer pretend she was just his secretary acting as his girlfriend, because what he felt for her was real. The morning after the gala, Emily Dawson sat at her desk at Grant Enterprises, still feeling the warmth of Alexander Grant's lips against hers, still trembling from the confession that what bound them was no longer pretend. She tried to bury herself in emails and schedules, but her concentration dissolved each time she replayed the terrace moment beneath the city lights. When Alexander arrived, his eyes immediately sought hers, and the quiet acknowledgement that passed between them said more than words could. The day unfolded in a blur of meetings and calls, yet every chance they had to share a glance carried the same unspoken truth. They were no longer acting. That evening he drove her home himself, dismissing his driver, and when they reached her small Brooklyn apartment, he insisted on walking her up the steps. At her door, neither of them moved to unlock it. Instead, he pressed his hand gently against the frame above her head, leaning closer until his breath mingled with hers, asking softly if she regretted what had happened. She whispered no, and before she could finish the word, his lips captured hers again, deeper this time, filled with hunger and urgency. The kiss stole her breath, his hand cupping her face while her fingers gripped his shirt as though anchoring herself in the storm of emotions. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, his voice low and rough as he said he was in too deep to ever walk away. Over the following weeks, their relationship became an intricate dance of secrecy and exposure. At work, they maintained professionalism, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. But outside the office, their bond grew stronger. They shared late dinners, walks through Central Park, whispered conversations in the back of the limousine, and laughter that broke through Alexander's stoic exterior. Emily discovered he had a wicked sense of humor, a love for jazz records, and a habit of sketching buildings in the margins of his notebooks. He learned that she sang when she cooked, that she dreamed of writing a novel, and that she had once promised her mother she would only marry for love. Each revelation drew them closer, weaving a tapestry of intimacy far beyond the boundaries they had set. Yet shadows lingered. Victoria Ashford was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. She began appearing at the same events, her presence like a constant reminder that their secret was never safe. At a gala in Midtown, she cornered Emily near the ladies' lounge, her smile sharp and dangerous as she warned that women like Emily never lasted in Alexander's world. She accused her of being a distraction, a temporary indulgence that would ruin him, and promised she would expose her for the opportunist she believed her to be. Emily held her ground, replying calmly that Alexander was not a prize to be won or lost, that he was a man capable of choosing for himself. But her heart pounded as she left, knowing Victoria's threat was more than idle cruelty. The tension escalated at the annual Grant Enterprises charity ball, hosted at the Plaza Hotel. Alexander arrived with Emily on his arm, their chemistry undeniable, and the cameras captured every smile and every subtle touch. Inside, Edward Grant greeted Emily warmly, praising her as though she had already become part of the family. But Charles remained distant, his eyes watchful and calculating. As the evening progressed, Alexander pulled her into a slow dance, his hand firm at her waist, his gaze fixed only on her as though the entire glittering ballroom had vanished. She confessed quietly that she was falling for him, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and his reply was immediate and certain. He was already hers. Their lips met in the middle of the dance floor, unashamed and undeniable, a kiss that silenced whispers and replaced them with thunderous applause. For that one moment, Emily felt invincible, cradled in the truth of their love. But as she caught sight of Victoria at the edge of the crowd, her eyes cold and gleaming with fury, she knew the storm was only beginning. Because love had made them strong, But love had also made them vulnerable, and Victoria was ready to strike where it would hurt the most. Victoria Ashford was not a woman who accepted humiliation, and after watching Alexander Grant kiss Emily Dawson on the ballroom floor, she felt her world narrow to a single burning mission: expose the lie and destroy the woman who had stolen what she believed was hers. The following morning, she summoned a private investigator to her Park Avenue penthouse, a man known for digging deep and unearthing secrets others thought long buried. She handed him a folder with Emily's name, instructing him to uncover everything: her family, her past jobs, her debts, even the smallest trace of scandal that could be twisted into ammunition. For 2 weeks, the investigator shadowed Emily, combing through her life, but what he found frustrated Victoria even more. There were no skeletons in Emily's closet, no hidden affairs, no scandals, only a young woman who had struggled through college scholarships, worked long hours at a library, cared tirelessly for her widowed mother, and carried herself with quiet dignity. The very ordinariness of Emily's life infuriated Victoria because it left nothing to destroy. She turned her focus instead to proving the relationship itself was false. She bribed a junior employee at Grant Enterprises to steal appointment logs and was delighted to find inconsistencies. Moments when Alexander and Emily's supposed timeline did not align with company records. With that, she crafted a story, one she would present at the perfect moment. Her chance came during a shareholders' gathering at the Waldorf Astoria, a night meant to celebrate Grant Enterprises' new expansion deal in Europe. Emily accompanied, Alexander in a floor-length emerald gown that made her eyes shine, and from the moment they entered the ballroom, all eyes were on them. Alexander introduced her with calm authority, his arm around her waist as if she belonged there as much as he did. Victoria watched from across the room, her smile sharp as glass, waiting until the speeches concluded before stepping into the spotlight. With icy elegance, she raised her glass and congratulated Alexander on the company's success. Then with deliberate precision, she turned the conversation to Emily. She asked when exactly they had first met, her tone casual but laced with poison. Alexander replied smoothly, recounting the Boston conference, but Victoria pressed further, citing specific dates and noting that Emily's employment records placed her in Charleston at the time. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Victoria produced the appointment logs, claiming the relationship was a carefully staged performance to avoid the arranged marriage. Gasps echoed as she painted Emily as a manipulative secretary who had taken advantage of Alexander's rebellion. Emily's cheeks burned, but before she could speak, Alexander stepped forward, his voice cutting through the whispers with unwavering command. He said the dates were wrong because he had lied to protect Emily's privacy, that their first meeting had not been at a conference but months earlier in a bookstore where she had recommended a novel that still sat on his nightstand. His tone was so firm and sincere that no one dared question him, and Emily's breath caught in her chest as he described details that felt too vivid to be invented. He spoke of her laughter, of the way she had insisted he buy the book even though he had claimed he had no time to read, and how that moment had stayed with him until fate brought her into his office. The crowd melted with admiration, and Edward Grant's booming laugh silenced the last of the doubts as he declared that anyone who questioned Alexander's judgment clearly didn't understand the family legacy. The applause that followed drowned out Victoria's protests, and, though she tried to insist she had proof, no one cared to listen. Humiliated, she left the ballroom in a storm of red silk and shattered pride, her power slipping away with every step. As the room settled, Alexander turned to Emily, his hand tightening around hers, and whispered that he would never let anyone humiliate her again. She stared at him in awe, realizing that the lie he had told had been less about protecting their act and more about protecting her heart. In that moment, she understood something terrifying and beautiful. His love for her was no longer just growing. It had already taken root, and hers had too. The fallout from Victoria Ashford's failed attempt lingered like smoke after a fire, and though Alexander Grant had silenced her in front of the shareholders, Emily Dawson knew the battle inside his family was far from over. Charles Grant called a private meeting at the family estate, demanding Alexander attend, and for the first time Alexander insisted Emily come with him, not as an assistant, not as a cover, but as his partner. When they arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The long oak table filled with silent relatives and Charles sitting at its head like a king ready to pass judgment. Charles wasted no time, declaring that Alexander's actions had placed the family name at risk, that his defiance had humiliated them in society, and that this so-called romance was nothing but reckless indulgence. He turned to Emily with cold eyes and accused her of playing a dangerous game far above her station. Emily felt her stomach twist, but before she could answer, Alexander rose from his chair, his voice steady, yet burning with intensity. He told his father that every achievement, every deal, every sleepless night at Grant Enterprises had been for the family, but for once he would not sacrifice his happiness for their approval. He said Emily was not a distraction or a lie. She was the only truth he had ever known. And if choosing her meant losing the empire he had built, then so be it. The room erupted with shocked murmurs, but Edward Grant struck his cane against the floor until silence returned. The old man's eyes gleamed with pride as he spoke, reminding Charles that love had once softened even the hardest of men, that Alexander's mother had been the light of the family, and that denying his grandson the same chance would be a greater betrayal than any arranged marriage could repair. Patricia nodded firmly in agreement, praising Emily's strength, and slowly the tide of opinion shifted. Charles clenched his jaw, unwilling to yield, but Alexander stepped closer to him, his voice lower now, his words meant for father and son, alone. He told him he had spent his entire life trying to earn his approval, but tonight he realized he no longer needed it, because for the first time, he had found something worth fighting for, beyond money and power. He reached for Emily's hand and pulled her gently to her feet, declaring before everyone that he loved her, not as an act, not as a performance, but with every part of who he was. Emily's breath trembled as tears welled in her eyes, but she met his gaze without hesitation and confessed she loved him too, that she had fought it at first because it felt impossible, but the truth was undeniable. She had fallen for the man behind the suit, the man who sketched buildings in the margins of his notebooks, the man who carried his mother's grief like a shadow, but still had the strength to believe in love again. Her words rang through the room with such sincerity that even Charles could not speak against them. For a long moment silence hung heavy, then Edward raised his glass and toasted to the courage of love. One by one, reluctant at first but soon with genuine warmth, the family followed his lead, and though Charles did not raise his glass, he did not stop the toast either. That alone was enough for Alexander, who tightened his arm around Emily with a quiet exhale of relief. Later that night, as they walked out into the cool air of the estate gardens, away from the eyes and whispers, Alexander turned to her with the stars reflecting in his emerald eyes, and said he had never known peace like this. Emily laughed softly through her tears and told him it wasn't peace, it was freedom, and they had found it together. He kissed her then, slow and deep, not out of defiance or desperation, but out of pure, unshakable love, sealing a promise that no power, no father, and no empire could ever break. And as they stood beneath the night sky, their hands intertwined, their hearts unguarded, both knew the act was over. The performance finished, because what had begun as a lie had become the truest story of their lives.